Distinguished panelists and participants, I welcome you to this webinar on behalf of ARNEC and its partners, Save the Children, UNICEF EAPRO, and the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, in supporting stronger regional advocacy on the urgent need to address the complex links among early childhood development, climate change, and environmental degradation. This webinar will formally launch the document From Most Vulnerable to Most Valuable, a scoping study to put young children at the heart of climate actions and environmental protection. The objectives of the seminar are to first present the scoping study and encourage careful reading and wide dissemination of its findings. Secondly, discuss how the results of the study will inform the development of a regional roadmap to be created in collaboration with ECD and climate change stakeholders. And third, show how urgent it is to act on this issue now, including the need to build a coalition and a movement to promote the agenda for climate ECD-informed climate and environmental actions. As we move rapidly into a world more and more affected by the twin crises of climate change and environmental degradation, let alone the crisis of COVID-19, there is a growing recognition that young children will be the most profoundly affected by these crises, but also that they are at the same time the least well represented in the policies and programs designed to respond to current impacts and plan for future consequences. This scoping study, written by Early Start at the University of Wollongong in Australia, is a pioneering response to this situation and has been designed by ARNEC and its partners, UNICEF, EAPRO, and Save the Children International, to put young children at the very heart of climate and environmental actions. This scoping study brings together evidence from the Asia-Pacific region and insights from experts and partners around the world to explore the strong interlinkages among climate change, environmental degradation, and early childhood development. The essential aims of the study are first to enable ECD systems and services to become more climate responsive, resilient, and ultimately more adequately funded, and that they may be better understood by policymakers and climate scientists, both as systems seriously affected by the impacts of these crises and as important actors in helping young children and their families and communities face these impacts. The webinar will outline the three major components of the scoping study: a survey and desk review of global impacts, an Asia-Pacific sub-regional analysis with case studies, and a final component on looking forward recommendations and the child-centered approach. This webinar will bring together the research team of the scoping study, ARNEC partners, and other key stakeholders to demonstrate the importance and urgency of this report in the context of climate change, share key messages and findings from the report, and provide insights on how to move forward to address the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on young children. The first comprehensive study of its kind, this scoping study is a key part of the program which ARNEC, in partnerships with others, has been working on since 2019. A regional initiative on ensuring a clean, safe, and sustainable environment for young children. The goal of this initiative is to mobilize both national ECD and climate change and environmental policymakers and local communities to provide adequate financing that enables ECD systems and services for young children to become more climate resilient, increase their adaptive capacity, and strengthen the larger, more global movement towards sustainable development. The emphasis of this work will necessarily be on children of vulnerable populations, especially during their first 1,000 days. In 2023, we will continue to work towards this goal by taking forward the findings from this scoping study and, in consultation with various actors and stakeholders in the region, by developing a regional roadmap on climate-sensitive and resilient ECD, prioritizing actions at all levels, in homes, communities, schools, and ECD programs, among youth leaders, and at the policy level. National and regional advocacy campaigns informed by the regional roadmap will also be undertaken. We hope that we can engage and collaborate with you on all of these activities in the coming year. I would now like to hand over the session to the moderator, Evelyn Santiago, the Executive Director of ARNEC and the lead for this initiative. But before doing so, I invite everyone to watch a short animated video which helps frame ECD and climate advocacy. Most vulnerable and most valuable young children and climate change. Thank you.
Supporting young children is a smart investment and should be placed at the forefront of the fight against climate change. Young children aged 0 to 6 are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but they are also the most valuable group in the fight against it. Well-financed, high-quality and equitable early childhood programs create immediate impact and ensure the long-term success of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Investment in early childhood accelerates progress towards all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Young children are more affected by the impacts of climate change and large-scale environmental degradation than any other group. Air pollution, disease, forced migration, and extreme weather events like heat waves, flooding and drought affect young children directly. They create toxic stress, disrupting children's brain development, their long-term physical and mental health, and cognitive abilities. This can lead to chronic problems that will be carried by the individual, the community, and a nation throughout the life of that young child. Young children may be the most vulnerable, but they are also the most valuable. High-quality early childhood development programs support children's potential to build healthy, well-educated, socially and emotionally competent, peaceful, and resilient communities throughout their lives. Policies and programs that support healthy early childhood development are therefore one of the most effective interventions for a better future. They provide a cost-effective, comprehensive, immediate and enduring path to achieving sustainable development in communities. By increasing climate knowledge in early childhood development settings and by building strong relations between policymakers and the climate science community, we can realize the full potential that early years development has in addressing the effects of climate change. Systems and services for young children need to become more climate resilient. To make this happen, they need to be adequately funded and their value better understood both by policymakers and climate scientists. Funding for climate change mitigation and adaptation must allow financing of early childhood development programs. We need to see early childhood development as a key to addressing climate change. We want your help. Learn more about how to support early childhood development as a fundamental and cost-effective tool in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Help us connect policymakers, practitioners, and climate scientists. Together, we can create practices, systems, and policies that protect young children from the effects of climate change now and make their societies sustainable in the future. Early childhood development is crucial to achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Sheldon, for your opening remarks and for sharing the video, which beautifully sets the stage for today's webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Before anything else, let me share with you the outline of today's webinar. Can we move to the next slide? First part is the preliminaries, and you have already heard from ARNEC as Sheldon gave his opening remarks. We will also hear from UNICEF, EAPRO, and the Bernard Bandier Foundation. Andrea, can you just flash the whole slide? Yeah. Second part is the presentation of the scoping study by the University of Wollongong, Australia. This will be followed by a panel discussion with 4 panelists joining us from UNICEF Pacific, BRAC Institute of Education, Commonwealth Youth Health Network, and Centro Escolar University in the Philippines. After the panel discussion, we will open the floor for some questions from our participants. Then we will have the closing to be led by Save the Children Australia. So this will be the flow of today's webinar. Next slide, please. We have a good lineup of speakers and presenters for today. First, we have Mio Zin Yun, who is the Deputy Regional Director at UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office. Then we have Rashda Majid, the Chief Program Officer of Bernard Vandier Foundation. Next, we have Mark De Rosnay, Professor of Child Development and Academic Director at Early Start University of Wollongong. Mark, led the research team for this scoping study. We also have Joy Milan Malur, an early childhood development specialist at UNICEF Pacific. We are also happy to have Dr. Harry Govind, a medical doctor and a health fellow at the Global Consortium of Climate and Health Education. Next, we have Dr. Manjuma Akhtar Musumi, Assistant Professor and Head of Academics at BRAC University in Bangladesh. We also have Dr. Rita Lucas, Dean of the School of Education, Liberal Arts, Music, Social Work at Centro Escolar University in the Philippines. And last but not the least, we have Caroline Dusabay, who is the Pacific Education Senior Advisor at Save the Children Australia. We'd like to thank all our panel speakers for joining us today. But before we get into the details of today's webinar, let me run through a couple of reminders. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the ARNEC website. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature located in your Zoom meeting control. And last but most importantly, please provide your feedback on this webinar by completing a short survey at the end of the session. A link will be provided, for this evaluation later. Okay, so now I'd like to call on our first speaker, Mr. Mio Zin Yun, Deputy Regional Director at UNICEF EAPRO, for his remarks. Mr. Yun, thank you for joining and being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, a very warm welcome from Bangkok. I'm very honored to be part of this important event to launch our Asia-Pacific Regional Scoping Study on the linkages between the ECD, early childhood development, climate change, and environmental degradation. This is especially critical following the recent conclusion of the UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, which spoke to the urgent needs for adaptation and resilience building. The regional study, from most vulnerable to most valuable, is a result of our partnership with ARNEC and Save the Children International. The study, written by the Early Start University of Wollongong, reveals compelling evidence from countries, experts, and partners in the region that the climate crisis is a child rights crisis, and young children are impacted disproportionately, though they contributed least to this crisis. They must not be forgotten in the climate discourse and actions. As part of our collaboration, we have several joint efforts such as ARNEC Regional Conference focusing on ECD and climate change. We organize multiple webinars to articulate these linkages. We also release a regional call to action, produce an advocacy video, and now with the release of this regional scoping study, all with the intention to share the urgency while advocating for positioning young children and ECD into the center of climate actions and environmental protection in the Asia and Pacific region. Let me share some evidence. 17 million babies under the age of 1 year breathe toxic air. Almost 1 million stillbirths a year are linked to air pollution. Nearly 90% of the burden of the diseases attributable to climate change is borne by the children under the age of 5. These statistics are staggering. It has a deep implication on our young children for their survival, development, growth, and well-being. Climate change does not affect everyone equally. Compared to adults, babies, toddlers, preschoolers are much more vulnerable to climate change and environment degradation, starting from in utero fetuses during the first 1,000 days when brains develop the fastest. The cost of inaction and sidelining young children in the climate action is just too high. We know that every $1 spent in a child's first 1,000 days of life, there is a future return of $17 if we target young children who are the most vulnerable. Negative impacts from climate and environmental shocks in early childhood can last throughout a lifetime, with risk of deepening intergenerational poverty and inequities. On the other hand, young children are also valuable active agents of change in our climate and environmental responses. So, early childhood development ECD is therefore key in addressing inequities more efficiently and effectively early on than tackling it later in life. Investment in ECD policies and programs across all nurturing care components such as health, nutrition, early learning, responsive caregiving, security and safety can increase adaptation and resilience of our young children to climate change impacts. As we strengthen to develop potential of young children, we will also be reaching many of the SDGs as we would like to have. Let me touch a bit on the importance of the partnership. Strong partnerships across sectors with a range of stakeholders become even more essential as the young children in Asia Pacific and their caregivers continue to suffer from climate change, environmental degradation, and other compounding crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic. As UNICEF, we are already working on many country-driven solutions across the region, including to protect young children in kindergartens from severe air pollution, develop climate-smart school frameworks starting from pre-primary level, and engage youth advocates at policy forums to raise voices on the need for more child-centered approach in climate change. In order to move this agenda forward, impactful partnerships such as the one we have now with ARNEC, Save the Children International, etc., are critical to uplift the voices and the needs of the young children. Going forward, UNICEF is committed to continue our engagement with ARNEC, Save the Children, and other partners in close collaboration with the government ministries and key partners in the region as well on this urgent topic. Let's continue to advance the nurturing care needs of the young children at scale to put young children and ECD at the heart of climate actions and environmental protection. Let's transform the lives of our young children from the most vulnerable to most valuable towards a resilient future. Thank you very much, and back to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Deputy Regional Director Newt, for your inspiring message and for once again reminding us on the evidence, why we need to address the impact of climate change on young children and highlighting UNICEF commitment to work with partners, in addressing this important issue. Now we would listen to Rashida Majid from BVLF. There is a pre-recorded, video. Which
Hello everyone, my name is Rashida Majid and I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Bernard Van Deer Foundation. First of all, I would like to thank the entire team at ARNEC on the launch of a scoping study that links climate change and environmental degradation and its impact on young children. Climate change and of course its impact on early childhood remains an advocacy priority for the Bernard Van Deer Foundation and of course for our partners such as ARNEC. In 2021, our Early Childhood Matters edition focused on climate change and its impact on young children, and subsequently through our work under Urban 95, which is our cities initiative looking at how cities can support young children and their families better. Through this work on Urban 95, we have seen cities increasingly focus on climate resilience, greening, and so many other initiatives that are supporting young children in neighborhoods, in communities and cities. And so we are very glad to see that this report and this scoping study has finally been launched. Of course, this could not have come at a better time. This is a time where some of the vulnerable communities are most impacted by climate change. Of course, young children and pregnant women and families that are young families are quite affected, are most affected by the impact of climate change. Therefore, the need to focus on this issue, not only through thinking through funding, but also thinking through better systems that are more integrated, that are also looking at integrating this issue of climate change and really making it resilient in many ways is the need of the hour. And the report actually goes on to provide solid recommendations on how communities, cities, decision makers can think about this particular issue from the lens of young children and their families. So we are very excited about the launch of this report, and of course we hope that it is very useful to you in your own work and serves as a starting point for all the actions that you can take in your own work to support the cause of young children and their families and the impact that climate change has on them. Thank you.
We are very grateful to Bernard Van Leer Foundation for the support that they provide in this, advocacy, on ECD and climate change. Now we go to the second part of the session, which is the presentation of the scoping study, from most vulnerable to most valuable. A scoping study to put young children at the heart of climate actions and environmental protection. It is a strong foundational piece of work as we articulate the deep interlinkages between climate change, environmental degradation, and early childhood development. To share with us the key findings and recommendations from the study, we have Professor Mark de Rosnay, a professor of child development and academic director at Early Start University of Wollongong, where he leads interdisciplinary early childhood initiatives. Mark led the University of Wollongong's research team in undertaking this scoping study for ARNEC. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I hope that my screen is clear to you. And let me first say a huge thank you to ARNEC and to its partners, UNICEF and Bernard Van Leer Foundation, for funding this work. I just want to make a sort of personal note at the beginning, which is when Evelyn approached us, when ARNEC approached us to do this work, we looked at it and we were overwhelmed by its scope and its the detail and the many different perspectives and the many different domains of expertise. And we said to ourselves, how can we do this work? How can anybody do a global scoping study or presume to know so many details and answers and approaches? As we got into it, we had a different question. The question was, how can we not be doing this work? As we got into it and we understood the importance, we understood that we're a small piece in a puzzle and this is a first step, but a very important first step. And I want to congratulate ARNEC for taking that initiative. Hopefully, this piece of work will provoke other pieces of work, will provoke argument and investment and discussion and policy innovation. And we will look back at this in a few years and say, gee, how far we've moved beyond that initial scoping study. And on that note, I want to introduce the scoping study, which we've entitled Most Vulnerable to Most Valuable. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, Catherine Nielsen-Hewitt, Lisa Kervin, Anthony Oakley, or Tony, Ellie Taylor, Carol Strubrand, and Lisa Kilgariff, a great team that helped me do this work. So back in 2022, we were presented with a wide scope, which included a global impact survey and snapshot based on desk review of existing evidence, funding schemes, policy frameworks, etc. A questionnaire addressing climate change and environmental degradation impacts in relation to ECD within subregions of the Asia Pacific. License to do expert insights through focus groups and interviews, the encouragement to develop case studies, and we also had the input of an advisory committee, which we appreciate very much. This is, if you like, a wide scope. You might even call it a shotgun approach, looking in many places, looking at existing evidence, looking at existing reports, tapping into the knowledge of experts to try and pull together this very broad area and give it a focus on early childhood development in relation to climate action and environmental protection. And this resulted in a detailed set of recommendations concerning the adoption of the child-centered approach to climate actions and environmental protection, what we are calling action on multiple levels, and I'll talk about that, and policy considerations. Now, 3 parts to the report, so I will structure my presentation in keeping with that. But let me say that I'm only able just to pull out some elements. It's a very large report, and it should be available to you very soon, and we hope that you enjoy digging through it and finding the bits that speak to you, that are important. But it is a very complex piece of work, and today all I can do is just highlight some of the approaches and some of the details. So if I start with the Global Impact Survey and Desk Review, which covers chapters 3 to 6, and I should just say the earlier chapters are more concerned with the positioning of the work, both in terms of the methodology that we adopted, and we do give a full account of that, but also in terms of the recognition that we have frameworks to support children's rights and pursue work which increases equity, but we haven't integrated that into many of the frameworks, policy frameworks and programs that we pursue in order to respond to climate change and environmental degradation. I won't go into that early part of the report. It's there for you to see, and I'll start with the Global Impact Survey and Desk Review. Now, you probably are familiar with this figure, I hope, and it's a beautiful paper that was in Science. So it's quite overwhelming in some ways. But what it attempts to show is how much more profoundly young children today will be affected by the climate instability in terms of heat extremes and severe weather events. And I won't read this quote out to you. I'll leave that there for you to have a look at later. But the reason I put this slide up is because it helps us understand the need to focus on young children. We can come at this from many angles. We can come at it from the rights perspective, which I think is appropriate, and we've done at the beginning of the report. We can come at it from the basic science, which is to say there's overwhelming evidence that young children today will bear the brunt of adaptation in the future, and the actions we take today can either lessen or intensify the harms that they suffer. They're not going to be able to remove them, unfortunately, but they can certainly make a difference. So what I want to do is focus on what we call the rigorous differentiation of children by developmental period. So in chapter 3, what we argue is that in order to keep our eyes focused on young children and to understand how ECD can best be integrated with climate action and environmental protection, we need to stop referring to childhood or youth. We need to start being rigorous in the way that we think about how the meaningful periods of development are consequential for for outcomes and for impacts. And this is a gross oversimplification for the purpose of the presentation, but I just wanted to highlight some points here. If we start with the prenatal fetal period up to birth, what we find is that fetal responses and adaptation to external stimuli can have lifelong impacts on health and well-being. Only beginning to fully appreciate that we are only beginning as a research community and an epidemiological community to understand the full extent of neurodevelopmental vulnerability. But we do know that the period prior to birth is extremely important and needs independent consideration as we focus on the first 1,000 days. That period is included as a period in which the developing child is extremely vulnerable. We know that infants have heightened sensitivity to environmental toxins and pollution. Climate extremes and nutritional fluctuations are acutely felt by youngest children, and there's a heightened dependence on the caregiver at this time amplifies negative impacts of stress and trauma. As we move into the preschool period, we know that preschool-age children require safe access to an expanding range of experiences and environments, and they're still very vulnerable to fluctuations in availability of the caregiver and they need access to high quality early childhood education if they're going to, we now understand they need that to, as it were, reap the lifelong benefits of engagement with the education system. When we reach the formal schooling, or primary school, what we see is that access to formal continuous education lays the foundation of children's resilience and ability to adapt to future circumstances. And the ability to benefit from educational experience is highly dependent on contextual factors, safety and stability. And so even in the period from conception to 7 or 8 years of age, we see a huge diversity in the ways in which we need to focus on the particular needs of children in relation to climate change and environment degradation. What I want to do now is just bring this to life a little bit by talking about some of the experience we had in Australia with respect to the bushfires back in 2019, 2020. They were really quite on a scale that we couldn't anticipate. And if anyone follows Australian news, you'll know that we have since been subject to floods on an equally grand scale. So we are at the very front edge of climate change and we're feeling its effects quite dramatically. So if I go back to that diagram, I just highlight some points that we're better placed to focus on if we think in a differentiated way. So we know increasingly we're starting to understand of the threat to the developing fetus due to maternal stress prior to birth and also to poor air quality. There's some fascinating work out at the moment which shows how exposure to stress and air pollution can affect, is likely to be affecting the developing fetus. So this is a lens that we need to adopt in order to meet the needs of children into the future, and it's developmentally specific. In our context, what we learned a lot of things. I'm just highlighting a few things, of course. If we looked at preschool children, what we learned that was children's behaviour in many ECE settings, early childhood education settings, suggested high incidence of trauma. We saw that very widespread across the state of New South Wales. And we saw that for older children, there was protracted issues around access to school. Now, we can maintain this kind of lens and say, well, this differentiation is helpful. But what we explore in the report is the idea of giving this another dimension, saying, okay, we can look developmentally at meaningful periods. That's very important. But there's this other body of work, the Nurturing Care Framework pioneered by WHO and its partners, looking at differential aspects of nurturing care and the early childhood developmental environment. And so what we can do is we can, as it were, in a two-dimensional space, we can think developmentally, and we can think functionally across these different areas of impact: health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, safety and security, and early learning. And all I wanted to really show you here was, once we map those two dimensions together, we see how dramatically our thinking is impoverished. And this has all sorts of implications that we learnt for ourselves in Australia during the bushfires. I'll just give you a couple of examples. If we think about, I highlighted the issue of poor air quality caused by bushfires and the impact that has on the growing fetus. This is a new perspective for us. We weren't aware, that wasn't in the forefront of people's minds. Next time there's a bushfire, there will be a more differentiated approach. We know that exposure to air pollution from bushfires is very bad for children with asthma and other issues. And so that's something we understand already. But actually, and I was at the coalface, if you excuse the pun, I was in the Department of Education meetings where we were determining the regulatory responses. What we realized at this time was the failure to differentiate school-age children and prior to school-age children meant that we had clear actions for school-age children in the context of primary school, but how to protect preschool-age children and what the impacts were on preschool-age children were much less well understood, and we didn't have ways of responding. So by not anticipating the needs of children in a differentiated sense in different domains of health and well-being, we weren't ready, and we had to adapt in real time, and policy was developed at very high speed to try and help the early childhood education sector adapt to the issues around children's exposure to the air pollutants caused by bushfire. I won't go any further. I hope that just illustrates the point. Well, how well are children represented in policy frameworks? We did a part of the report. We did a review of current policies and programs, looking at national, international frameworks. We did some case studies on specific countries, and I direct you to that in the report. But I just wanted to make this sort of higher order point. In the major international agreements and frameworks, the needs of children might be acknowledged, like children might be mentioned, but there's little recognition of the disproportionate impact experienced by young children and the distinct supports that they require to meet future challenges for adaptation and mitigation. So there's a big gap there, which brings us to the second part of the report, which is to try and do some descriptive work in a more focused way with the lens on the Asia Pacific and its subregions. So I'll just talk you through a little bit of that and how we approached it. One approach was to break the Asia Pacific up into 4 regions, so Oceania and Pacific, South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. It's very imperfect, and there are huge fluctuations within those zones, but nonetheless, it's a helpful exercise. It helps to sharpen the mind. So I want to show you how we tried to capture information at the sub-regional level by giving you a preview of the profiles that we developed. So this is Oceania and the Pacific, and what we found here is through our scoping review, through our questionnaire, through our interactions with experts, we were able to identify very high-level challenges in this region. That's not to say that many challenges were experienced across many regions, and this is not exhaustive, but nonetheless it focuses the mind, and it helps us to think about anticipation. And anticipation is an issue I really want to stress. We need to be able to anticipate what we're going to encounter, and I'll come to that at the end of the talk. And what it does is it maps these challenges onto the nurturing care framework. It also highlights areas of opportunity. And the Pacific at the moment, there's some fantastic work being done through the Pacific Regional Council for Early Childhood Development around multi-sectorial engagement and a focus on ECD, and also to some extent empowering children's voice. And then we link that to the recommendations that we provide at the end of the report, very concrete steps that people can think about taking in many different areas to start to address some of these issues. Now, of course, regional profiles led to regional comparisons, and there are some quite dramatically different issues. So some areas in the Asia Pacific have extremely bad air pollution issues, whereas of course in Oceania and Pacific you have issues with flooding and displacement, different sorts of issues, but again, issues that can all be anticipated. I won't go into these case studies in any detail, because I don't want to run over time, but I just want to highlight for you that below the sub-regional level, we then had case studies, and these case studies were based on chapters 7 and 8, where we analysed the questionnaire and the interviews and the focus discussion groups with experts, etc. And what we did was identify regions where we could hone in on specific countries and programs and practices that are worthy of note, see where there were areas of opportunity, see where there were areas of innovation, and also start to do some differentiation. So in this particular case study on Mongolia, we present a sort of, as it were, a higher order summary of the issues that are being faced, the climate change and environmental degradation issues that are being faced. We look to identify good practices. So, for example, this engagement country partnership framework with the World Bank to address impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on the most vulnerable populations. And we looked for areas of innovation. So in Mongolia, we see the Strong Health Networks, which is highly focused on treating children with respiratory illnesses, so a good adaptation response. We see the development of the Green Development Policy, which recognizes that the service landscape needs to shift to meet the needs of the population in response to climate change and environmental degradation, and also the Youth Climate and Clean Air Network, which it enables and starts to empower young people to become more involved in climate actions and environmental protection. Similarly, there were 4 case studies, just showing you 2 quickly. India, again, we provide an overview of the core issues. We identify areas of good practice, especially I just want to highlight coming out of COVID-19, the sort of renewed focus on climate change and environmental degradation resilience. I can hear a voice in the background. Is that okay? I'll keep going. And innovation. We already heard from Bernard Van Leer Foundation about the Urban 95 program, for creating healthy urban environments for child development through cross-sectorial collaboration, and also the Warrior Mums movement, which I just am so impressed by. That's a movement across many areas of India to address the impacts of air pollution on early child development, but also to raise awareness of community impact on decision makers and policy makers. So really a grassroots movement that's making a big difference. So let me move now in this final bit, and I have, I think, 5 more minutes, and if I've gotten the timing right, to just talk about some of the recommendations that follow from this report. First of all, we want to stress the fact that we want to make a call, as it were, of action, a call to action on many levels. It's wrong, we think, based on the work that we've done, to focus on any specific issue. So what we have done is sort of, not exhaustively, but in great detail, we've gone through different levels of society and government, as it were, and thought about what actions can be taken at these various levels. So we start with building resilience within families, talk about how we can enable communities to be more involved, so more of that local level stuff. We focus specifically on schools and early childhood education settings as a very important environment for integrating early childhood development better into, or more effectively, into climate action and environmental protection. We talk about strengthening programs and how to do that, and also have a series of ideas and recommendations around shifting services or creating resilient child-centered services. So that's dealt with in Chapter 11. In Chapter 12, we unpack a series of policy considerations. I don't have time to go into these in detail. I'll just highlight the main themes for you. So first of all, as I hope is now a familiar idea, is this idea of rigorous disaggregation of childhood based on meaningful developmental transitions and other child characteristics. So we can do this, and I'll talk in a second about a tool that enables this kind of thinking in a more rigorous way. We need to focus on young children's voice. So that is to say, we need to create situations where children become more actively enabled to participate in their communities and in meaningful ways in their communities, not just in trivial ways, but in meaningful and substantial ways, so they can build up their own understanding of the issues that face them, but also to build up their own agency and their collective agency, to see themselves as effective actors into the future, and also to keep our policymakers and decision makers on their toes so that they understand whose interests they are serving. We need evidence-based policy development. At the moment, in many jurisdictions, there are very poor mechanisms to understand where resources need to go in, for example, relation to that nurturing care framework description of early childhood health and well-being, and also in relation to different domains of developmental periods that are meaningful and transitions. We need to focus on young children's learning and education environments. I've spoken about that already. And we need attention to funding mechanisms that can allow, in particular, we think, attention to be given to initiatives that are working in locally and contextually sensitive ways. It's a great starting point to look at things that are effective and to think about how those things can be grown and improved through policy, through effective policy. And we also need to focus on children's physical environments, and the Urban 95 is a great example of that. So I just want to say a couple of final words about what I call the child-centered approach. And I want to acknowledge the Children in a Changing Climate Coalition back in 2017, who wrote this very excellent paper, Realising Children's Rights in a Changing Climate. And they promoted this idea of taking a child-centered approach to climate change and adaptation. And what it means is focusing on the specific risk factors faced by children in a changing climate, ensuring children's needs and capacities are central to adaptation planning and implementation of programs and policies, and increasing the voice and agency of children in adaptation decision-making processes. So we need to think about how to extend this perspective into early childhood, and that's been part of the work of the report. Taking a child-centered approach to climate change adaptation for young children also means taking that inherently developmental approach, using a holistic framework to understand and differentiate children's nurturing care needs, and a focus on child characteristics of importance such as gender, the presence of disability, and so on. So if we go back to our two dimensions, those meaningful transitions in developmental period and also in the sort of different areas that have been identified within the WHO Nurturing Care Framework, what we would say is we need to add some other dimensions to this. When we look forward, we need a tool to help us think about how we're going to anticipate the needs of children in relation to development, in relation to the Nurturing Care Framework, but also in relation to the severity of events, varying duration of events, and the tractability or intractability of events. And the floods in Australia are an excellent example of that. We have children who've not been able to attend a school for 6 months because of the floods. And that, of course, needs to be thought about in advance. So I would say that, sadly, we have a pretty good idea about what we're likely to experience. As Australians, that's certainly true. There's no excuse not to think about what it means in terms of preparing for young children. And so we would like to sort of propose that people think about how they might develop a tool that can be used alongside other policy and program decisions, implementation decisions, to stay very focused on these elements. And these are the aspects these are the features that we think need close consideration in order to build such a tool. So we need to identify differentiated impacts, domains of impact. We need a determination of whether or how environmental and climate impacts differ in relation to the stage of development. So is the effect different in infancy compared to childhood? We need a determination of how or whether environmental and climate impacts differ in relation to other important characteristics of the child, and that's going to differ by jurisdiction. So the issues such as gender and presence of disability are good examples. We need to understand how the duration, intensity, and tractability or intractability of environment and climate change impacts affect children differently and also cumulatively. We need to articulate the ways in which proposed or current responses will address the differentiated domains of impact and how that will be evaluated or measured. Remember, we need to think about building up good evidence for future policy. And we need to be accountable to children, and we've made some points about that as well. So I'll wrap it up there and hope that you enjoy the report and look forward to getting feedback, criticism, suggestions, and all else from readers. So please don't be shy about contacting us. Thank you very much for giving us this chance to present.
Thank you, Mark, for really sharing the important elements of this report. I know it's very complex. It's a huge, scope of work, and we're very happy that you took on, this big piece of work, which will really be feeding into how we would shape this regional initiative. You went beyond the scope, so let me take this opportunity to thank you and the whole University of Wollongong team. We're just starting, Mark. So please hang in there. We would need more of your thoughts on as we go through this initiative. I know there are a lot of questions from our participants, but I'd like to request that we park those questions for the moment, and we will come back to them after the panel discussion. We have 4 panelists to share their insights on the scoping study and how can they make use of some of the findings as shared by Mark to support their respective work on ECD and climate change. At this point, I'd like to invite our panelist, Joy Milan, Dr. Manjuma, Dr. Harry, and Dr. Maria Rita to put their cameras on so our participants can see you. I'd like to remind our speakers that you have 5 minutes each to share your reaction on the scoping study and respond to the questions that I have for each one of you. Let me begin then with Joy.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Joy, the Pacific has been a major champion, and a key player in encouraging investments in ECD, including the need to invest on a climate resilient future. Pacific is a model for the region in addressing, ECD, and more recently, linking it with the issue of climate change. Can you speak to us on the Pacific Regional Council for ECD's work in this area and how you might use some of the findings from this scoping study as you advance your work in the region, in the Pacific, on ECD and climate change?
Thank you, Evelyn, for the opportunity. Thank you to ARNEC, and warm greetings to everyone from warm and sunny Fiji. This scoping study is timely and important because, as you say, Evelyn, it marries two of the Pacific region's priorities. As many of you know, Pacific Island countries, small island nations in the vast Pacific Ocean, are at the forefront of climate change. And more than a crisis, really, climate change here is a current existential issue for Pacific Island countries as they see rising sea levels and devastating disasters potentially wiping out their homes, their communities, their countries. In fact, some of you may even know about Tuvalu, who's been in the press recently, already talking about a metaverse to replicate its country virtually as it faces looming wipeout due to climate change. So the reality of climate change for the Pacific gives the region the moral authority to speak out so loudly across all the platforms on climate change response. On the other hand, Pacific Island countries have also been steadily progressing commitment and action on multi-sectoral ECD, with many countries developing the policy frameworks and early years programs that ensure their youngest citizens have the best start to life, right? So the study, again, is timely and important because it brings together those two priorities on climate change and young children. And there has been, as you have noted, Evelyn, much work and relatively advanced discussions on those two areas. What we now have begun to do more strategically with UNICEF Pacific and the Pacific Regional Council of ECD, of which UNICEF Pacific is a secretariat, is joining up those two work streams, ECD and climate change camps, so that they speak to each other, they fertilize each other, because they ought to. And this study, what it does is that it outlines the compelling case of why that needs to be done. And I think more importantly, it provides initial recommendations of how that can be done. In February 2023, in about 2 months from now, 15 Pacific Island governments are gathering across the sectors of finance, education, health, and social welfare to discuss ECD and resilience. So this study, I'm very grateful for it because it helps inform those discussions. What we appreciate with the scoping study in particular is how it extends the discourse beyond the narrative of young children as the most vulnerable to climate change. Because as I've said, especially for the Pacific region, which faces the impact of climate change on an almost day-to-day basis, the recognition that climate change affects children, families, and communities is almost a given. It's a day-to-day fact. So what has been more exciting for us in the region and the Regional Council for ECD and its coalition of partners, including UNICEF, is a case for ECD investments as a critical pathway for resilient Blue Pacific communities. So we're not only presenting a problem, we are also presenting this bright opportunity and solution for sustainable development in the region. And as the study points out, the work is two-way, right? We need to have a child-centered approach in climate change policy and programming, and vice versa. We need to mainstream climate resilience in ECD policies and programs. On the former, we're happy to share that Pacific Island governments have been slowly advocating for ECD prominence in regional and global climate change discourse. For example, RMI decided to include ECD within its climate change portfolio at the recent COP in Egypt, with Adrian Cerezo, who's here in the webinar right now, embedded as part of the government delegation. So like this study, that was a scoping mission, and we recognize that it would take several more COPs to really elevate the ECD agenda globally. But again, because ECD has already so much traction in the region, I would say it has been more straightforward than other regions to link that up with climate change. And in very practical terms, if I may also share, the value of this study is now there is a well-articulated document to hand over to governments and partners as a basis of a discussion. When I traveled to RMI, for instance, in October this year to support their climate change preparations with Adrian and Zoraya, who are here on this webinar right now, government counterparts were asking for something they can refer to, on ECD and climate change. And frankly, we had nothing to share as a really comprehensive reference on the issue. So it's really good to have this initial study as one of the key documents to help frame the discussions with governments, especially since it mentions the Pacific advances in this area. It is especially crucial to have these discussions going as climate change financing kicks into even higher gear with loss and damage funding mechanisms. So what we hope Pacific Island governments support even more strongly is amending the mandates of these financing mechanisms to support the amendment of those, to recognize the importance of early childhood and allow for funding of ECD programs so that they can be of better quality and more equitably distributed across the region. So on the second point now, in terms of mainstreaming climate resilience in ECD policies and programs, we are also gaining traction. And this study helps underscore that need and point some way forward. In page 40 of the study, it notes specifically that climate change is not specifically mentioned in any existing ECD plans. And I'm happy to say that we're now helping to change that. UNICEF has been supporting countries in the region to make more climate-sensitive ECD policies and costed action plans. And across 9 countries of UNICEF support, we have been strengthening national ECD policies so that climate resilience is front and center. Kiribati, which just finalized their ECD action plan, climate action is one of their 9 strategic priorities. In RMI and Solomon's ECD policies, there is a statement there that says all elements in this ECD policy are supportive of the climate resilience and sustainable development policies of the country. And therefore, this ECD policy calls for direct and close collaboration between the ECD community and environmental sustainable development community. So to wrap up, how do I see this moving forward? I'm just sharing a few initial reflections here. I think we need to create more knowledge sharing and to build capacity in this area, this webinar being one example of that. And for us here in the Pacific, using platforms like the biannual ECD Forum to keep elevating the work. I think we also need to think about how we can repackage this study into different knowledge products, policy briefs, advocacy campaigns, technical manuals, etc. And also to think about maybe how we may repackage them for climate change professionals that may not have as deep an understanding of fairly common ECD lingo like the nurturing care framework. And we would be happy to continue to have follow-up discussions with everyone to see how we can do that. So it's also particularly suited to the unique contextual features of small island nations. And lastly, as our Deputy Regional Director has echoed, we also echo the need for even stronger alliances and partnerships. And we hope to position the Pacific Regional Council for ECD as an even stronger ally of ARNEC and other multi-sectoral alliances in terms of elevating that ECD and climate change discourse in the region and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for sharing, how you see the value of this scoping study as you advance the work in the Pacific region, and we will continue to collaborate with you, as we go along. And I think you have really pointed out very specific suggestions in terms of repackaging, in terms of building the packaging, the report, and building the capacity in the region, more platforms and opportunities for knowledge sharing. And we will do that. So thank you, Joy. Now we move to Dr. Manjuma.
Hi, everyone.
From BRAC Institute of Educational Development. Thank you for joining. Dr. Manjuma, this scoping study is the first of its kind, a cohesive academic study on the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on ECD. At least, in a region, I think this is really a pioneering study. I'd like to ask, how is the topic of young children and climate change being addressed at BRAC? And how do you see this scoping study helping? How could it help research institutions to support the advocacy on ECD and climate change?
Thank you so much, and thank you to Mark for presenting such a brilliant piece of paper on climate change and early childhood development. It's a very timely and, of course, significant paper that all of us are looking forward to. So in Bangladesh, climate change already has pronounced negative effects on livelihoods and children's health and well-being. 80% of Bangladesh is affected by climate change, and some major hazards are floods, cyclones, river erosion, soil salinity, and many more. And this results in the loss of lives, land, property, and the displacement of people. Climate change has wrecked lives and livelihoods, and which has also led to thousands of climate refugees abandoning their rural homes and migrating to urban cities. Now, this scoping study, and at the same time, other research also shows that that extreme weather events experienced during early childhood have a low impact and also negative impact on the poorest and most vulnerable groups. So these early stage shocks also have significant long-term consequences. Now, BRAC, it's a Southern-led NGO with 50 years of experience operating cost-effective community development programs at scale through ECD, education, health, nutrition, and humanitarian response, and many more. We reach almost 100 million people in Africa and Asia. So with regard to climate change, BRAC is working with communities on locally led climate adaptations, including in our education programs. So for nearly 4 decades, BRAC education program focused on community wisdom for climate adaptations while building structures for its one-room schools. Now, when we were scaling up the one-room schools across Bangladesh, we focused on the kind of structures that were made by communities in their specific climate regions. As a result, the one-room schools range from structures made with clay to those made with bamboos, and others were made of tins. Some were also built on stilts to deal with flooding. We have also focused on recycling and using materials that promote environmental conservation. We have, for example, children come to schools with glass bottles with water filled in to help them clean the slates. The slate pencil would also have holder made of bamboo, which were made by the parents. All the books were carefully wrapped by paper that could be reused, that were reused papers. And the children who would be sitting on the jute mats, those were painted by the community. So today, the play labs that we have in Bangladesh and several other African countries, we use the old plastic containers to make spoons for the sandboxes. We also use the plastic containers as a shoe rack. We also use the plastic caps to decorate the ceilings. We also have designed play spaces to be more efficient for the weather condition through implementing unique, cost-effective ventilation systems and taking advantage of the outdoor spaces to teach children about the environment around them. We focus on kitchen gardening, we focus on environment conservation, we focus on recycling. The curriculum also includes modules on protecting the environment, teaching young children to care about environmental conservation and caring for the communities. Another work surrounding climate adaptation that BRAC does is board schools. Now, board schools serve as a mobile classroom and is an adaptive measure for children living in the wetlands of Bangladesh. Now, during the monsoon season, these board schools drops off the children from the respective areas. Now, they were introduced with a very simple philosophy. If children cannot go to the schools, schools will go to their children. Board schools classrooms include a mini library. They have a corner with books about climate change, about pollution, and about other issues that the world is facing today. So we have to remember that children's socio-emotional development, cognitive development, these are connected with nature. We have a relationship with nature, and there are connections between early childhood development, climate change, and mental health. Mental health has implications on early childhood development. Climate change has implications on mental health. Now, this study can help the research institutions to build on work that focus on holistic play-based early childhood development, how children can learn in green, climate resilient play spaces. Also, these play spaces can be supported by caregivers, communities with psychosocial support and nurturing care. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Manjuma, for sharing the various efforts taken by BRAC Institute in terms of addressing climate change in the context of early childhood development, and also for mentioning the importance of linking it as well with the social emotional development of young children, which I think is really very important and critical. So thank you for your insights. Now we move to Dr. Harry Govind, the Doctor and Asia Lead of Commonwealth Youth Health Network. Harry, climate change is an intergenerational issue, and we know that the inclusion of youth professionals and advocates is key to advance the agenda on protecting young children, in climate crisis. Can you share your thoughts on how the key messages, of the scoping study can reinforce, the need for a global movement of young professionals, parents, and other champions, to support climate resilient early childhood and sustainable development? Harry, over to you.
Thank you, Evelyn, for the kind remarks, and good morning and vanakkam from South India to all my co-panelists. The most affected, the least responsible, and the least represented in climate change are children in the earliest days. The concept of building resilience is that you not only see the resilience of a people in the short term, but 30 to 40 years down the lane. It is, as many of my co-panelists said, is to ensure the future of the whole community, if not the whole planet. Thus, building resilience in the earliest days of life, as aptly said in this study, is not merely a response, but an act of empowerment. At COP27, in one of my many conversations with Adrian, he likes to refer to young people like me as the tomorrow, but I completely disagree. We are the today, and I'll tell you why. At this point in the international community, young people are often seen as a commodity. Oftentimes it's for tokenistic purposes, and many times it is to click a picture with those very important people, mainly to validate the climate processes and their actions happening around the globe. But regardless, we as young people have access to more places that are usually closed off to adults. And we have the ears of important people. Because when we make a stink, the world listens. Climate change is climate change because we decided it was an existential issue for us. This study brings to light the current lack of focus on young children is what is causing them additional harm, and the importance of placing nurturing care needs of young children at the very heart of climate change and early development actions. Furthermore, it stresses that young children need to be active participants in environmental and climate responses, and their education and knowledge need to be cultivated. And this forms the main reason why I call us, the young people, as the today, especially for the agenda for climate change and early development. Because one, we are maybe the most important stakeholders apart from the children themselves. Because we might be the today, but we were children yesterday. And climate change didn't start yesterday, but long before we were born. And we understand its consequences very well. Two, I call us the today, not only because we are activists, but as young professionals driving change in international systems, programs, and research. The paper states leadership is needed to reconceptualize funding mechanisms and multi-sectoral collaborations. Well, let me tell you, we are the leaders of tomorrow who will reconceptualize funding mechanisms and multi-sectoral collaboration. Three, not only as young professionals, but as young parents, we are very much the most responsible for providing all 5 aspects of the nurturing care framework, as mentioned in this paper. So a global movement of young people, young professionals, young parents, involving children in every step of the way will not only ensure that these recommendations stressed in the study will be followed in national or local contexts, but we will make sure it is tangible in a planetary context. And hence why I believe we are the today, and we are the best advocates for the most vulnerable, least responsible, least represented, and most valuable. Thank you. It was a short one, but thank you.
Well said, Harry. Thank you so much for articulating how youth movement can really support the need to bring early childhood development at the center of climate, discussions and actions. And we really look forward to working with you and the whole youth movement in advancing, this important agenda. Now we move to Dr. Rita, the lead researcher for ECCD Council of the Philippines study she's just undertaking, right now. So Dr. Rita, you have been undertaking, this research with the ECCD Council about parents, teachers, and local leaders' awareness and perspectives on climate change. If you can just briefly share with us about the focus of the research, and most importantly, how you see the alignment between the emerging findings of your research with the results of the scoping study. Over to you, Rita.
Thank you, Evelyn. I hope that the 5 minutes will be enough to share now. But upfront, I would like to say that this micro research really echoes the findings of the scoping research presented by Dr. De Rosnay. From the macro to the micro view, we discovered the same scenario of the children's vulnerability and the need for greater awareness and sharper focus to be given to these vulnerabilities. Our micro study focused on 2 areas, one in Davao de Oro and one in Eastern Samar. We took 8 barangays each from these 2 areas. And the study aims to determine the people's experiences related to climate change and environmental degradation, the local leaders, parents, and teachers' attitude towards climate change, and their preparedness to respond to the crisis. So the data we obtain hope to inform program planning and to give recommendations to ECD programs. So particularly, we wanted to see the level of awareness of the parents and teachers about climate change, their attitudes about it, the impact of climate change in their lives through their lived experiences, and the local government's readiness in responding to this, to their plans and projects. And then we drew recommendations for ECCD programs and services. So we use questionnaires, interview, focus group discussions to obtain data from parents of children ages 2 to 4, their daycare teachers, and also the local leaders. So for the results, first on the level of awareness, we gave a 20-item questionnaire, and all the respondents did very well. So we say that they have a good theoretical knowledge about what climate change is. And yet, in the survey, 95% still said that they needed more information, especially on how to respond to the effects of climate change. And to this, they rely on basically television and radio to get information. Also, they consider the government information reliable. On the attitudes about climate change, no one is negating that it is actually happening. In fact, all of them believe that they are now experiencing and that it is happening, and that they are concerned about its effects. So 77% believe that climate change is due both to human activities and the natural changes that are happening. So what is the impact in their lives? All of the respondents reported that they have truly experienced it, and that it has worsened the effects of the storm, flooding, and landslides in their area. So one thing we discovered, especially in Davao, who in the past decades have not known about typhoons. No? They have zero experience of typhoons. So for them, it's truly a paradigm shift when they experience this Typhoon Pablo. They kept on repeating as clearly the sign of climate change is happening to them. They shared about the traumatic experiences because of the sudden and powerful, devastating typhoon, no, which was truly a new experience for them. In fact, they were joking when it first came. that we only put typhoons inside the can. That doesn't happen to us. But when it did, it really caused, such trauma, not only to the children, but to the parents themselves. And on livelihood, of course, on crop destruction, and also affecting adequate nutrition for the children and the families. Second impact is on climate anxiety, no? Particularly the children becoming afraid, running inside the house with any sign that it's going to rain or that it's raining hard. So very, very clear in their sharings, the existence of climate anxiety among the young children. They hide in the room, in the cabinets, because they are afraid that the water is coming in again. And of course, another impact also is on the effect of schooling because of extreme rains. They stay in evacuation areas, and therefore there is stoppage of classes in the daycares. And also they have observed temperature becoming warmer and warmer, and children in the daycare center do not want to go for outdoor play. Now, I think that's very crucial, because even if you provide space, they don't want to do outdoor play, and they're not focusing because it's too warm and they just want to go home. So for the responses of the people, they shared about their own ways that they deal with it. Like they say they clean the canals, the drainage before the rain comes, lessening use of appliances, and also tree planting. And also they shared about having a family disaster plan. They were saying what will be brought, who will bring it, the heavy things daddy will bring, all these things. They have their own plan when disaster will strike. On the local government response, on human security, they focus on integrated and disaster risk assessment results, which becomes the basis for the action. Let's say for safety and security, housing relocation, although they also shared about challenges in doing this because of the resistance of the families themselves to go to safer places. Also, they have a child protection area. They have programs dealing also with the psychosocial well-being, especially when they mentioned two very, very strong typhoons that really caused loss of lives. And it was very difficult for the children who suddenly lost their parents and their siblings. Now, on the priority of knowledge and capability building.
Rita, sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap up?
Yes.
We'll have more time, I guess, in terms of sharing the results of the research, once it's completed. But if you can just, wrap up,
Yes.
your sharing in a minute.
Yes, okay, thank you. So all of these findings led us to give the following recommendations. No? So first is the curation of available materials about climate change, including information on appropriateness for the different early childhood levels, as mentioned earlier in the presentation. Integration of environmental care and climate change concepts in the existing national early learning curriculum of the ECCD here in the Philippines. The importance of contextualization in the preparation of climate change lesson guides, development of material storybooks based on the experiences of the community, teacher training modules on both content and pedagogy, because this is what the daycare teacher said. No, they don't know how to, what strategies to use regarding climate change education, and also training on debriefing for both teachers and parents for children who, in order to address trauma and the anxiety experienced by children. So in all, we say that the scoping study presented is valuable in effecting paradigm shifts in the minds of leaders, parents, teachers, directing greater awareness on the vulnerability of young children. As emphasized in this forum, the children are most valuable because they are our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. And we really look forward to learning more about the results, of the micro research, which you are, completing, I guess, at this time.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah. So thank you to all our panel speakers for sharing, your insights on the scoping study and the work that you do in addressing climate change as this affect young children, their families, and communities. Now we have, I think, 5 minutes left for questions from our participants. And I'd like to open the floor now, for some questions. May I request our panel speakers to keep their video on, and I also invite Mark to join, the panel, as our participants may also have some questions for you. Okay, let me just look through the questions that we generated, from the registration. We have one. Mark, this is for you. Can you expound on what you mean by a child-centered approach in designing and planning for climate change programs, and policies? And there is also a question related to that on how do you actually ensure that this approach is also, applicable for children, with developmental delays, those children with disabilities. Mark?
Yes, I'll do my best to answer that. So the idea here isn't to imagine that you're sort of usurping adaptation and mitigation policy development. The idea is that you're building into that process a kind of rigor around responding and planning for children, young children, in ways that can, to meet needs that can be anticipated. And that's why we think a tool is a helpful thing, because decision makers and policymakers are constantly involved in looking at real circumstances and designing a response to that circumstance. That, of course, has its own movement and agenda. But if they can pick up a tool that says, have I thought this through properly in terms of ECD impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, or whatever the issue they're responding to is, then we're more likely to get that representation. So that's one level. Another way is actually developing approaches that are specifically designed to improve how we do things for children and how we do things with children. In terms of doing things for children, you will see that we've developed or presented a very holistic approach based on meaningful transitions in development, based on nurturing care framework, and also based on context, which can be very diverse. So that's a holistic view of responding for children, but you also need to have a view of the child as a whole person. So that is a view of the child as somebody who is growing into their own capacity to act in the world and take leadership and to be assertive and to make a difference and to have a sense of themselves as an important actor. So the child-centered approach actually comes, we call that the top-down and the bottom-up elements. It has both incorporated. I think I can't go into detail about, specific child characteristics, but in different places, different issues need additional emphasis. I think the issue of disability is one that's close to my heart. And so there, I think, very active inclusion of children with disability in early childhood education and care. That's certainly not universal in the regions that we're familiar with. And of course, those children then can't benefit from such innovations if they're not included. So I'll just leave it at that. And I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Harry, we have a question for you. How can pediatric professional organizations contribute to this movement? I ask this because I know you're a medical, doctor.
So firstly, I would say as pediatric professionals, especially in India, they do not understand the relationship with even not only pediatricians. I don't want to generalize, but looking at it even from a broader perspective in community doctors, they don't really understand the impact that climate change has on early childhood development in young children. And I think this study goes a long way in providing the preliminary data. But I think being able to understand how the pathways through which it impacts. We understand that air pollution has an effect, but what can be done to further, I would say, mitigate and adapt, and going a little bit further, also see how and build resilience in the early childhood. I think that would be the very essential aspect of how pediatricians and doctors themselves can contribute in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Harry. I'm really sorry we don't have time for to address all the questions, but we promise to note all of them, and we'll make sure to respond and make it as part of our documentation, which we will be sharing with you. So thanks to all our panel speakers for sharing their insights on the scoping study, and for responding to the questions that we have. We are now ready to turn over to our friend from Save the Children to formally close this webinar and share some of our way forward. I'd like to call on Caroline Dusabe, the Pacific Education Advisor from Save the Children Australia. Over to you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you so much, Evelyn. Thank you so much to the presenters and the panelists and to participants. I thank you so much for active participation, for the many questions and comments in the chat box. I can say this is just the beginning. I think based on what we've had today, based on how urgent this issue of climate change and the environmental degradation is, even emerging from the COP27 and also with the launch of this study, this is a real good opportunity to build a coalition and a movement to move forward this agenda on addressing the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on young children. I think this study has given us very good insights, not only in understanding that young children are the most affected by the climate change and environmental degradation, but they are also the most valuable, and also investing in young children is a smart solution in terms of sustainable development, resilience building, and so we are on the right path. I think one of the things I would like to emphasize as we close is around what colleagues have talked about in anticipating the needs of young children as we think about planning and responding to the needs of children, and also thinking about the differentiated domains of impact and also the developmental stages and how young children across all these developmental stages are impacted differently by climate change and environmental degradation. And also thinking about action at different levels. So at this point, action at only one level is not enough. So thinking about that action from the family, the community, the schools and ECE settings to the policy level. So looking at that action and thinking about how we can push for leadership to take more a stronger stand in terms of the funding and financing, as well as also the multi-sector coordination in terms of climate action. In terms of the next steps, I'm sure you're wondering what we are going to do next after this launch. As Sheridan mentioned, in 2023, ARNEC, Save the Children, UNICEF, and other partners supported by the Bernard Van Leer Foundation are taking forward these findings from the scoping study and developing a regional roadmap on climate-sensitive ECD and resilience building, prioritizing actions at different levels, as I said, at the home, community, schools, policy level, obviously in consultation with different sectors and stakeholders in the different countries in our region. So we hope this resource can support all our efforts, our combined efforts to mobilize ECD, climate change, and environmental policy leaders, young professionals, communities, schools, parents, and caregivers to take action in promoting adequate financing that enables ECD systems and services for young children, of course, with the emphasis on the vulnerable population. We've seen that the impact of climate change and environmental degradation are not equal for all children across all regions. Even within the same setting, different children will experience more severity than others. So it's important to think about who is the most vulnerable in a given context and what kind of attention they will need. So we are excited to continue engaging and collaborating with you throughout this coming year. So please keep checking the ARNEC website, sign up and get email updates, and we look forward to collaborating with you more. The recording from this webinar is going to be shared after the call, so you can find it on the ARNEC website. And so please feel free also to share widely with colleagues who are not able to join. Lastly, would like you to participate in a simple evaluation before you leave. There is a link in the chat box, or you can use this QR code on the screen and provide us your feedback. It will take just 1 minute, but your feedback is valuable to make sure that future webinars, future activities are rich and interesting for you, our participants. Thank you so much, participants, presenters, and speakers, and look forward to collaborating with you again in the coming weeks, and especially in 2023. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you, everyone. Have a good day.